Hello, everyone, and welcome to this NIE Care online dialogue. I'm Charlene Rajendran, part of the drama team in the Visual and Performing Arts Department at the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. The NIE Centre for Arts Research in Education, or CARE, is a research centre based in the Visual and Performing Arts Department, which generates, collects, and disseminates high-quality research that promotes education in and through the arts. In this series of dialogues with applied theatre and drama education scholars and practitioners, we explore questions that deal with the importance of the arts in developing justice, hope, and creativity. We also consider what it takes to engage meaningfully with difference and change. The speakers, Selina Busby, Kelly Freebody, and Molly Mullen, are internationally renowned thinkers and leaders in the field of applied theatre and drama education. They explore ideas about how to deepen scholarship and enrich art making in varied sectors of community and across boundaries of culture and location. They collaborate with multiple stakeholders in their research and practice, generating interdisciplinary approaches that spearhead how the arts, especially drama, enhances socio-emotional literacy, criticality, and well-being. In these dialogues, they articulate some of the primary motivations for their work, specific areas of focus and emerging questions about what else is needed in the field, and they offer valuable research frameworks and examples from their practice about some challenges and opportunities of working in multimodal and intercultural spheres. We invite you to listen to the dialogues with the individual speakers as well as a joint dialogue where we explore ideas that emerge in the conversation and warrant more attention as a group. And we hope this will offer a valuable resource in your work as a scholar, educator, practitioner, student, and audience member. Now on to the dialogue with Molly Mullen, who is Senior Lecturer in Applied Theatre and Participatory Arts and Deputy Head of the School of Critical Studies in Education at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. To this role, she brings over 10 years of experience producing theatre in education, youth theatre, community arts, and children's theatre projects in New Zealand and the UK, where she is originally from. Molly's research focuses on the ways in which theatre and the arts can contribute to social justice, environmental justice, and well-being. Most of this research is ethnographic and/or arts-based, involving in-depth, often collaborative fieldwork to understand the relationship between examples of practice and the context in which they are produced. She's also involved in collaborative creative practice projects, exploring issues of environmental and economic justice. For this work, Molly draws on a range of critical post-structuralist, feminist, and performance theories. She's also co-editor of Research in Drama Education, the Journal of Applied Theatre and Performance, otherwise known as RIDE. I've had the pleasure of talking with Molly about her ideas on how the arts is a crucial space for relationality and equity, and learned about projects that she's been involved in that include questions of environmental fragility and heritage loss. Her interest in the diverse economies of applied theatre and community-based arts practice, examining the multiple ways in which projects and organizations are resourced and managed, generates valuable thinking on sustainability and collaboration across different sectors of education and economy. Thank you very much, Molly, for taking time to share your thoughts with us and examine some ideas that are critical in your research and practice. Okay, Molly, let's just dive right in and talk about what it is you work with, the idea, the concept, the meaning, when you focus on justice in the work that you do in applied theatre and the arts more broadly, and why this is an important part of how you develop your thinking and your practice.
Yeah, good. This was such a good question to ask. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this since you sent the prompts over, um, both in relation to justice and in terms of well-being. So,
Mm.
what when I'm thinking about these concepts, actually, what I'm trying not to do is to have a fixed idea, or I don't. So I'm what I don't do as either a scholar or practitioner or a kind of practitioner scholar is have a this is my conception of justice. I've realized. I think in terms of my approach to these concepts and most concepts is I probably have a sense of openness, curiosity, and a sort of attraction to kind of plurality of
Mm.
meaning. And I think that's really um, so really what I'm interested in is thinking about what is the conception of justice, either that's being articulated here explicitly or implicitly by me or by someone else or this document. And what are the meanings and effects of this particular articulation? What are they going to be? Is it the right one really for the context? What's led to this particular conception? So um, I would think about justice as have it as being a sort of collection of ideas. So when I'm thinking about justice, I'm thinking about things like fairness, what's fair, thinking about power and equality and equity. Um, I probably am thinking about how is what is right and best being conceived of. Um, but it is probably a concern with fairness. And for me, thinking about justice in relation to theatre and applied theatre or drama education or performance practice um, is is to think about it as political. So for coming, I come, or I feel, so I do have some inclinations towards some particular ways of thinking about justice. So I do consider myself a critical scholar, um, which can mean lots of different things. But I think that's kind of it is anchored in a kind of critical thinking tradition, which is about um, sort of asking um, what are the kind of ideas and assumptions and relationships of power that are in operation here, um, and trying to question and contest those. Um, so I could never assume that a kind of theatre practice is a neutral practice.
Mm. Mm.
And, in that kind of classic Freire kind of way,
Mm.
education is never neutral. I'd say theatre's never neutral, performance is never neutral,
Mm.
drama education is never neutral.
Mm.
And so to be a kind of to think critically about that, to me,
Mm.
considers, well, if it's not neutral, then what is it doing, either intentionally or unintentionally? What are the politics of this practice?
Mm.
And what are the implications of that? Um, yeah, anyway, so I am definitely in a critical tradition, but probably more along the kind of feminist, post-structural, and um, sort of, I guess, thinking about this social and the ecological together. So what we call kind of socio-ecological way of thinking about justice now, more recently. I don't know if that's answered the question at all. That was quite a lot, but it was
Yes.
such an interesting question to ask. So I was like, I can't just reel you off.
Yeah.
Kelly might say, I don't know, sorry, am I allowed to reference? I'll reference
Yes,
Kelly.
you are.
When Kelly and I work together, we'll try and find a common framework.
Mm.
She's worked a lot with Nancy Fraser, who I think
Mm.
is a really useful way. And if I'm teaching social justice to my students, I want to give them some frameworks to
Mm.
work with, and I might give them Nancy Fraser as a
Mm.
way of thinking about justice to recognize justice issues. So I
Mm.
think we need theories and frameworks of justice to recognize when there are issues of justice in question. But I don't think there's one that I would say this is the one
Mm.
that I always look to or work with.
Mm.
Does that
No,
make sense?
yes, it does make sense. And it's very useful that you began with the need to be open to
Yeah.
the plurality that you want to respond to. And what I'm hearing is that it's a highly responsive approach to thinking about justice because it's very contextually based and
It's
it's,
contextual, it's contingent on the practice and the place that the practice is happening in.
yeah.
So, if I'm looking at something that's happening in a criminal justice system,
Mm.
I'm going to be looking at things in a different way to if I'm
Mm.
looking at something that's happening in a forest.
Yeah.
Even though the broader issues around fairness, power, equality, equity, relationality might be similar, what's right, who gets to decide what's right.
Mm.
But I guess what I'm really curious about how people think about justice, how they conceive of justice. And I want to know, I want to read all of those
Yeah.
ideas,
Yeah.
and think
Yeah.
about them in relation to, and not all of them are going to fit with every instance of theatre practice. So it's sort of
Yeah.
finding what works to
Yeah.
understand what's going on or what is being invoked here that someone maybe isn't as aware of that, but they're invoking this particular idea of justice without necessarily understanding it. And
Yeah.
so an example of that would be, I think, so some people will go, oh, capitalism, neoliberalism, that's the source of injustice. But I'd say actually there's a theory of justice in neoliberal capitalism. It believes that the free market is the fairest way to distribute resources in a society, and that,
Mm.
if we remove all constraints from the market, eventually through fair
Mm.
exchanges between rational individuals, we'll
Mm.
end up with a fair distribution according to everybody. Everybody's had, a
Mm.
chance to
Mm.
participate in an exchange. So there is a conception of justice there. It just might not be one that we agree with.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Mm. Yeah, so being the critical scholar that you alluded to, and therefore being willing to examine your own assumptions and find where you may have your own biases and your own prejudices or blindness, inability to see things. I'm curious about how then you navigate through some of the tensions that emerge, especially when you're working with people with whom you partially agree and with whom the ideas of justice, injustice, fairness, and even well-being for that matter are so varied.
Yeah.
How does then the work that you are trying to generate through the arts practice or through the
Mm,
research or through the scholarship attend to this?
yes. Well-being so is another, in a way, it's easier for me to say what I think about well-being because I feel like it's probably, um, I don't know. Yeah, it's been slightly easier to kind of think about. So thinking about well-being for me has to be thought about in relation to justice. And again, I think that is the kind of inclination of coming from a critical perspective, is to think uncritically about well-being. We could think about it at a very individual level, a very
Mm,
subjective level.
mm,
How does someone feel? And it's not to say that's not important, but to think about it to me in relation to justice means to think about what we also have to attend to what are the conditions that enable people to lead a livable life, to survive well, to
mm,
flourish. How, again, well-being can conceived in all of these different ways,
mm,
but that the kind of conceptions that I'm going to be drawn to and likely to mobilize in my work are ones that are more holistic,
mm,
more attentive to the kind of systemic environmental factors that impact on well-being, that think about well-being as being relational, collective, not purely individual. And so, in some cases, it might be thinking about it using the language of the social determinants of well-being, because that enables me to kind of communicate with people who are coming maybe more from what would be the right field where they use social determinants. Anyway, with people in like youth work or social work, we can find a common language. We might not mean exactly the same thing,
mhm,
but that concept leads us to think about social conditions and factors rather than just focusing on well-being about being about individual behavior or
mm,
attitudinal change.
mm,
Yeah. I think that does seem to be something that in this context in New Zealand, people feel quite easy to pick
okay.
up, because I think with the sort of the cultural mix in New Zealand,
Yeah.
from Te Ao Māori, from a Pacific perspective, health and well-being are holistic, and
Yeah.
it is always thought about as a sort of cluster of interrelated, sort of multi-dimensional factors that will
Mm,
contribute to well-being at a in multiple different levels. And
mm,
so, yeah, I think so in terms of having that kind of openness, and how does that support working with others? Was that the question? Or sort of
yeah,
when I
difference, how to work with
difference.
difference, and how the arts in particular creates a space for this difference not to need to be flattened, but nonetheless,
Yeah.
there is still the common language that you're talking about that needs to also be shared, and some kind of collaborative
Yeah.
understanding needs to emerge.
Yeah. I probably have, because I'm interested in collaboration and working across difference, having that kind of inclination towards being open to what other people bring, um, and being able to kind of not expect everybody to line up with the same
Mm.
set of views or kind of concepts, but we also do need to have some sort of common ground. Often, though, that would be, I'd be looking for a kind of, I guess, a common purpose
Mhm,
or a common project,
mhm,
and that, um, and maybe a set, what I do find useful, and this comes from J.K. Gibson Graham and the diverse and community economies framework, is the idea of kind of setting some coordinates.
mm,
So rather than a sort of map
mm,
that might say this is the route that we're going to
mhm,
follow and we all have to follow these things, coordinates kind of orientate us towards particular questions. So they frame it as questions, and this is to do with, you know,
mm,
economies. So maybe it is about considering, going through a process of considering questions together to
mm,
work things out. So committing to
mm,
kind of a reflexive practice
mm,
where we can interrogate together what it is we're doing and why, and agree on an outcome. So being able to have that kind of dialogue and conversation, and sort of being able to be flexible enough to kind of really listen and respond to each other in the context that we find ourselves in for that project. But I think also working with others, I do realize where my kind of boundaries are in terms of, you know,
yeah, yeah,
no, I'm
yeah,
not willing to,
yeah,
this is a kind of vision of something that I'm no longer, or not
yeah,
going to accept. This actually for me falls out of what I think would be just or ethical, or,
yeah.
supporting someone's well-being. And I probably, as I've matured,
Mm,
and become more experienced, become a bit
mm,
more clear on, actually, I just don't want to go down this
mm,
particular road, and I want to
mm,
be committed to things that, so I probably, but I sometimes learn those boundaries through the process of collaboration and conversation.
mhm, mhm.
Does that
So
make sense?
again,
Does that
it
just make me
does.
sound really wishy-washy?
No, not at all, because it then goes back to what you're saying about being non-prescriptive in the ways in
Yeah.
which you want to articulate or work with justice and well-being, but nonetheless knowing your own limits, your own boundaries, your own
Mm.
capacities and thresholds, even if those remain flexible and adaptive. So they then have the capacity to change depending on who you're talking with or what emerges through a project to open up new knowledge and understanding.
Yeah.
And I think it's valuable to think about how that is also related to your own sense of justice to yourself and your well-being to work with that, right?
Yeah. And also, I don't want to impose my
Mm,
version of a good life, a
mm,
just
mm,
outcome,
mm.
well-being onto someone else.
Yeah,
Sort of for me, maybe this idea of justice is for others, human or otherwise, to be able to
right.
articulate what that is to them, and to be able to listen and enter into a kind of relational conversation about that, or engagement that, yeah, because to me, yeah. if I was to, the idea of to tell somebody else what they
Mm,
need, what they want, what's right for them,
mm,
um, doesn't necessarily feel like the just thing to do or something that's going to support someone's well-being.
mm. And so if I
Yeah.
can ask you to then say how you think the arts, not just theatre, because I know you work beyond theatre,
Yeah.
and how the arts then provides a space, if not a language, if not
Mhm.
a modem within which to grapple with some of these tensions and questions, arguments sometimes, to
Yeah.
provide that multiplicity of perspective. What's it for you?
Yeah. Yeah, I think about this and I'm sort of grateful to a sort of colleague here, Sophie Jerram, who thinks a lot about the commons and commoning in relation to the
Mm,
arts. And
mm,
together, when we were on a project together, we started to think about the way in which working through the arts have this kind of really, um, I think it is quite distinct capacity to hold different perspectives, ways of being, views of the world alongside each other and put them into relationship with each other in a way that they don't necessarily need to synthesize or even agree.
mm,
But by using the arts, we can hear, we can bring things into interaction, we can juxtapose to kind of reveal different things. We can see how certain things might complement each other. We can create conversations which might lead to something unexpected and new that, that may be a synthesis, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And I think there's something about the arts for me that make that possible because they don't necessarily demand a neat resolution, or they
yeah,
don't demand tidiness and kind of a
yeah,
rational order and categorization of things.
yeah.
And yeah, so thinking about the work that Becca and I just did at the local race course
Mm.
and working with the different communities of that race course and thinking
Tell us a bit
about,
about it. Tell
oh
us a
yeah,
bit
okay,
about
so
it.
we made a work, it was called the Public Stand 2. It built on a previous work that Becca had made during COVID. So there's a race course in my local community that is, yeah, well, it's coming to the end of its time. It's been around for about 150 years, very important community space. So unusually, I've realised it's privately owned by the Jockey Club, but has always been publicly accessible as land.
Okay.
And particularly through the 20th century, used for sports, recreation, relaxation. There's a market there. So it's really used by the community. And has that use has been invited and permitted and sort of encouraged by the Jockey
Mm,
Club. But anyway, to do with the bigger politics of horse racing in New Zealand, it's going to be sold,
mm,
and the land will fall into the hands of a kind of national body who will
mm,
want to sell it and get the money to put into something else, to
mm.
horse racing priorities. So its future is precarious. We made a work which was a sound-based work, um, con weaving together different stories of the racecourse. It's got a really rich
Mhm,
history, rich
mhm,
ecology,
mhm,
but sort of exploring this idea of what does it mean to value and understand the value of this place, this land, this racecourse. We've also thought about in relation to recently of kind of upholding the dignity of this quite rundown place
mhm,
um, by highlighting the different ways in which it's valued. But anyway, we engaged with the as many different people who had a connection to the racecourse as we could,
mm,
and they all love and value the racecourse, but they
mm,
don't necessarily agree with each other. And in fact, some of
mm.
them might get in each other's way and annoy
Yeah,
each other.
yeah, yeah,
Um, but they cohabit in this place,
yeah,
and they sort of muddle through
yeah,
and try and find ways to live together. And that for me is community. Community
yeah,
is the endless process of trying to find a way to live together,
yeah,
whether we're human or not.
yes.
And so they're doing that. They're trying to be community at the race course. And the work could allow these different stories, conveying these different
Mm,
notions of what makes the racecourse valuable, to sit alongside each other without having to say, one of these is right or
Mm.
wrong,
Mm.
better or worse. We might have a view as
Mm-hmm.
residents, about what we think should happen to the racecourse and what notion of value we would really like to see taken most seriously. But for the work, we wanted everybody to kind of feel listened to. So, what you were saying around listening being really important and
Mm.
heard, and for people to hear and be able to sort of receive and think about those different
Mm.
stories and notions of value without us necessarily telling them this is what you need to
Mm.
think or feel at the end of it. But through doing it, they've really contemplated deeply this place and what it means and the different ways in which it is valued that might then lead them to think differently about its future.
Yeah. I like that there's a generosity of spirit that you're alluding to, which I think is an important part of the art making process as well, to bring things in, even as things are also then having to be put aside because there's a limited time and space and you have to make
Yeah.
choices. There's no question. You have to make choices.
Yeah.
You have to decide. But within that decision-making process, there's a capacity to include a range of different things that you didn't know about before, that you hadn't thought about before, as
Yeah.
well as to allow for different people, different spaces, different objects, different materials, different times and spaces to be part of this symbolic, poetic, metaphorical way of communicating rather than literal and narrow and specific.
Yeah.
Yeah. So linked to that, when you look at how to continue to support and sustain these processes of work through finding the resources of research, of funding, of training and education as well, what are some of the challenges when people want something specific? They want, hard data, so to
Mm.
speak, that quantifies and want it fast. That's what we're up against. They want it tomorrow and they want it for 20,000 people when you're working with 25 or 200, right?
Yeah.
What's involved in that aspect of the work?
I think so. One of the things I think there's the the experiences of that and the responses are really different depending on where you're situated in the creative arts ecology or the education ecology. So to be a kind of full-time employed academic on a salary for a university is really different to when I was working freelance in London or work part-time or on a contract that was dependent on a funding bid
Mm,
3 years and then you'd
mm,
have to fundraise for your next job.
mm,
So I think it's important to recognize that. And
mm,
so a part of what I see as something that I want to do in my role as a researcher for the university is to highlight where the funding system, the funding context, landscape doesn't support ethical, just arts practices, socially engaged art practices,
mm,
applied theatre, arts in education practices, and where it's not supporting the people involved in those practices to have a livable life, to support their livelihoods. And what those people consider a livelihood or to live well is going to be different. But, to kind of we can see where things are not working and understand where they're not working. And to me, it's about using the position that I'm in as a researcher to try and provide evidence, make
mhm,
the case, make advocate to funders and policymakers
mhm,
for what they need to do differently, actually.
mhm,
Because I think when you're in the field, it's quite difficult to both see and really understand what the problems are because you're so caught up in it and it really impacts on your material well-being and your physical and mental well-being if you're, struggling to make an income. I mean, here at the moment, the funding concept is so inhospitable for the arts, and really good people are really struggling. And when you're in that situation, it's quite difficult to step back.
yeah,
So I think it's important to use opportunities for research that can also be kind of advocacy or informed change for the better. It doesn't mean people are always going to listen,
yeah,
but maybe what I'm seeing over time is sometimes eventually something will land when there's a more
mm,
receptive
mm,
context.
mm.
and you're sort of always trying to sow seeds, always trying to get the message across,
Mm.
and it make sort of some inroads, and that requires also again a kind of collaborative approach.
Mhm.
So for me to be able to do that, I need to always be working in collaboration with people who are in the sector, because I don't have that felt understanding of what it means now to work in the sector because I've been out of it for quite a while.
Mm.
And so it needs to involve people who have lots of different perspectives on the sector. And if possible, people who have an involvement in policy and in funding, who can also, if you can find allies in those spaces, who can then really understand the right sort of angles, language to kind of support and start to create shifts and changes. I don't know if that answered your question, but I think
Yeah, it
that's
does.
one answer.
Yeah. I think it highlights the fact that there is a need to work across sectors, obviously, because as
Yeah.
an advocate, you are involved in many different things at the same time. It's not just pushing one message. It's not being a propagandist, which is sort of, okay, this message, this way, that's it. But to advocate is to really try and shift the landscape over the long term and allow for, again, those different voices to inform how the advocacy is even going to be effective rather than deciding in advance, this is how the campaign is going to be, and this is exactly what we're
Yeah.
going to do, and this is the poster. Um, so I'm curious about how then you bring scholarship to it, right? The theory,
Mm.
the deep thinking, the critical analysis that needs to allow for rich and complex ideas to become part of this process.
Yeah. I think the starting point was when I did my PhD, just entirely trying to rethink what I understood by economy in the
Mm,
first place, and what I
wow.
mean by both to completely rethink economy as practices of organization management, the sort of um, custodianship of resources, um, and again, a process of kind of living together and something that is made
Mm,
by people rather than something which is over there,
mm,
inherently capitalist,
mm,
determinate, um, omnipotent.
mm,
It's so, and that's come again from engaging with feminist economic theory and kind of um, post-structural economic theory. And that then makes the economy into a space of possibility and experimentation, where we can recognize all over the place people trying to do economy differently in more ethical and just and creative ways,
yeah.
um, which can be and of themselves mixed. So may have elements that are like there was a question around when does a theatre company become complicit or
Mm,
co-opted
mm,
to a
mm,
funder? Well, there could always be it's for me it's a question of degrees,
mhm,
like no, rather than the maybe look at what are the degrees of kind of where you're getting drawn away from what might be the thing you really want to do,
mm,
and where are you actually doing that to enable freedom in another place,
mm,
or in another form. So degrees of exploitation, degrees of freedom,
mm,
rather than always looking saying, oh, it's sold out, done deal, that's it, that's the reading, they've just been co-opted to capitalism,
mm,
done. It's like actually there's always more going on, and
mm,
we need to be able to look beyond that to see the ways in which theatre companies, arts organisations, grassroots organisations, even what we might look at as really problematic funders are either intentionally or unintentionally building other kinds of economies and things that we could expand on actually and kind of welcome more of. So that was the first thing, to think about economy more expansively as a place of possibility and diversity. Sim and similarly thinking about kind of policy in the same way as something as a bit more expansive than something that's just done to top down, kind of unilateral. So again, I think that's my tendency to be really curious about what this concept is, what this thing
Yeah,
is, and then how can we take it apart
yeah.
and kind of rethink it in a way that gives us more space and more
Mm,
possibility to kind of to do things ourselves
mm,
that
mm,
align with our politics and ethical principles, the pedagogies we want to enact, the kind of art we want to make.
mm.
Um, Now I've lost
Yeah.
the thread of the question.
Yeah. No, no. So it was asking you about your scholarship, and you began
Yeah,
with your PhD. And I'm curious about what prodded you to take on that topic. What was it in what you were observing and thinking about and reading and noticing as a gap that
yeah,
took you to that question for your PhD, and then
yeah,
subsequently enabled you to have the skills and capacities to continue that line of thinking?
yeah. So I did a theatre studies degree, and
Mm,
then I went and worked for theatre companies in London, running
mm,
their education and outreach departments and sort of being involved in setting up sort of applied theatre companies mainly with youth, young people, and really quickly realized that a big bulk of my time was taken up with funding, and
mm,
nothing had prepared me for that, and
mm,
how demanding it was. And and so when I went and did my master's at Central, I started in that dissertation to look at the intersection between policy and funding and practice, and that has remained my kind of preoccupation, to think about how do these things come together in kind of both problematic and productive ways or generative ways, and to understand that interrelationship. What I found when I started my PhD was that there was a lot of literature that really highlighted the risks and the dangers and the problem with funding for applied
mm,
theatre, the way that it could co-opt, bring in problematic agendas, skew
mm,
the kind of nature of the practice, like you said, undermine the temporality needed for practice, undermine the real genuine participation and involvement of communities. But there was almost nothing that said, well, here's what you can do. Here are some strategies. And so that's what I wanted to do in my PhD, was to look at, well, what are theatre companies actually doing? And how can we understand what they're doing, not as just another example of co-option, selling out, and that's where the feminist economics allowed me to kind of read those practices differently, in ways that actually aligned with the knowledge from the experience and the kind of intentions that the people in the theatre companies were saying to me.
yeah.
And that's also really important to me in my research, is that the people I research with are epistemic partners. They're my collaborators in the production of knowledge. And so I'm really wary of doing any kind of critical reading over the top of someone else's practice that says they're wrong. Actually, what they mean is this, or actually what's going on here is that. They just can't see it because, I'm the privileged researcher over here. So I want to find a way of exploring economies that aligns with the experiences and knowledge of the practitioners and the people in those companies, who are often scholars too. And they have so many strategies and insights for negotiating through very tricky conditions. And I think the more we can share and build on those, the better for everybody. And it doesn't mean it's perfect, but
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I think this co-construction of knowledge,
yeah,
particularly for the scholar who's often in the institution now, becoming more and more atomized and expected to churn out things that are independently sort of thought about, or
yeah,
etc. And shifting to an awareness that the co-construction is true to the knowledge being built rather than an aberration, right? This idea of
yeah,
objectivity and so on and so forth that sometimes still prevail. But more importantly, I think it's dialogic. What
yeah,
you're pointing to is a dialogic process of developing ways of knowing that emerge from the situation and the context, like you say, and the people and the material, and then the ways of thinking that can become imbricated with each other, because we do have different ways of thinking, and it's hard sometimes to understand our ways of thinking until we start talking to somebody else or listening to other ways of thinking to even develop that consciousness.
Yeah. And I've got another example of how the kind of research feeds into some of that advocacy. So since my PhD, I did another project looking at the economies of youth arts organisations in
Mhm.
Auckland who support youth, social justice and wellbeing for youth. And we made a series based on sort of really working closely with three organisations, looking at the policy and funding landscape. We kind of made a series of recommendations, but we sort of finished it just as COVID started, and the whole landscape
Mm.
for practice and also for
Mm.
funding just changed. And so nobody really listened, and it was like, okay, it's done, and it was really
Mm.
useful, and there were some publications. But just recently, there's a kind of national network for arts organisations who involve people who might otherwise experience barriers to the arts. And they've noticed that those organisations benefited from some funding that came about during COVID. That funding's all ended, and there's a kind of cliff that they're all facing now. And so they called a big sort of network meeting, and they brought in a lot of funders to have a conversation about what would it take to sustainably fund these creative spaces, these accessible arts organisations. And so I came in and I presented that research
Mm.
again. But the key thing to get across, I think, from that, and then from they were sort of talking about arts and well-being, and I was like, well, what I can see in all the research around arts and well-being, whether that's to do with funding or not, is that there's a dual intertwined. It's a expert area of arts practice that whose value and kind of impact outcomes depend on both the arts expertise and a kind of expertise in something else: health, therapy,
Mm.
social development, community development, youth development, advocacy. But it's the bringing of those together to create something new that responds to then a context that it's in: prison, a school, mental health. So it has that understanding. It's very contextually specific. In New Zealand, that's even going to be, locally specific to the community. So it was trying to get across this idea of to fund that, to understand its value and to fund it to achieve its fullest value, its impact, which is what the funders are concerned with.
Yep.
You have
Yep.
to be able to recognize that both and nature of the
Mm.
practice. But what the
Mm.
funding landscape does is it's an either or landscape. It either funds the
Mm.
arts or it funds the social or health
Mm.
outcomes. And then
Mm.
it doesn't value or recognize the other bit that's really
Mm.
important. And so
Mm.
something gets lost. And that's where it starts to create all these problems of the practice starting to become skewed, or organizations having to do these kind of weird processes of trying to report one thing to one funder and another thing to another. And but yeah, so I was able to put that across and really back it up with a lot of the funders, just here's all the arts and health evidence, but actually what that evidence is saying is that the outcomes are just as dependent on the aesthetic qualities and the, participatory, the amazing caring environments that are created. Those things are really important to the outcome. So if you don't recognize that, you won't get the outcome that you want. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
not the
so
same as just, yeah.
it's not the same as just fixing the language to make it work, but really sitting in between these different languages and almost being like a translator, interpreter to weave the connections and make sense to multiple listeners and then evolve a kind of um, meaningful coherence to what the work is about and be true to the work and the
Yeah.
practitioners, but also acknowledge that these do link to different demands and expectations positively
Yeah.
rather than just negatively. So kind of
Because I think
partnership.
there's a certain, utility in the
Mm.
short term to
Mm.
helping arts organizations navigate a very broken funding system. And here's how
Yeah.
you play the game and think strategically to
Yep.
get this money. But for me, the longer game is about changing the
Yeah.
policy and the funding system
Yeah.
um, to better support good practice in participatory, socially engaged arts, applied theatre as a really distinct but expert specialist area of the arts.
Mm. It's a kind of long-term goal where reform is really not just about quick change, but it's about
Yeah.
really working it through across time and space. What's emerging for you now as you think about new gaps, new ideas to explore and move towards?
Yeah. Some definitely thinking about arts, creativity, and ways of coming together at moments of kind of authoritarian, totalitarian
Mm,
threat,
mm,
both in historical and contemporary times,
mm,
um, and what that might mean, what that might involve,
mm,
um, and what as a way of articulating, in a way, the importance of the arts and creativity in education and society at these times. So, we're looking back at the past, 1942, the wartime, this
mm,
particular education experiment in Aotearoa, but also thinking about what's happening now in terms of we're at a moment where the arts are really being eroded from schools and universities
mm,
here in Aotearoa because there's a different kind of it's not totalitarian, but it's kind of I guess a tendency towards that way of thinking, trying to impose a total way of thinking about the value of education and the purpose of education over
right.
the system, which removes the arts as having a place or a purpose or a value in it.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so that's something that I'm definitely thinking about, which is leading me into some kind of philosophical areas that I haven't really thought about before. Um, and so that's been really interesting. What else am I thinking about? Rest
Mm.
and slowing
Rest.
down. Yeah.
Yes. Please say more. Say more.
Yeah, and again, this came about through, and I think it's connected actually to what
Mm,
were just talking about.
mm,
And partly it is a response to what you were saying. There's kind of almost hyper productivity. That's the word that I've been using this week, having
mhm.
read the most recent tertiary strategy that's come out for New Zealand. This
Right.
expectation of both academics and society as a whole, really, I think,
Yeah.
to be hyper productive.
Yeah.
Um, what does it mean? What is rest? What does it mean? Why might it be important to be still, to be quiet, to slow down, to do nothing, while at the same time recognizing that those things are a sort of, I don't know whether paradox is the right word, but to do nothing is not to do nothing. It's still generative, I think, if not productive in the sense of producing something of use in a capitalist sort of human capital development kind of way. And silence isn't the absence of sound or noise. It's something else. There's still something else going on. So yeah, really trying to get into those ideas. And we're not the only people. There's lots of people thinking about rest,
Yeah.
rest as resistance,
Yeah.
the politics of rest. But I think I'm interested in that when I'm thinking about. So the theme for IFTR next year is what can theatre do?
Hmm.
Um, and the idea of it almost makes me feel exhausted. I think because, like you were saying, we're just called on to do things and produce things all the time.
Mm,
Like, oh,
mm,
maybe
mm,
there is a value to doing less and producing less and
mm,
shifting the kind of
mm.
temporalities or working against those kind of rhythms and temporalities that are sort of make us feel like we always have to be doing something.
Yeah, I think acknowledging the exhaustion,
Yeah,
which we did a little bit better during COVID,
yeah.
because in a way we were confronted with a whole different temporality and a whole different space consciousness as well. And so we acknowledge the body a lot more attentively. Um, but it's becoming harder now because people want to go back to the hyper productivity, like you say, to be okay with being tired and therefore
Mm,
rest. Rather, it
yeah.
becomes a judgment of failure, or it becomes a judgment of weakness or something like that.
Mm,
Um, And I think it affects the arts and the way that you've been talking about it, because it takes a lot of energy and a lot of determination, as you've been saying, to work across boundaries and to work
Yeah.
with difference and to work in ways that are going to really be generative. And that energy has to come from somewhere, and it's not short term, it's deep and long. So I'm curious about how it is you are approaching this question of rest and what is emerging in terms of actual ways to incorporate the thinking into ways of being, ways of learning, ways of
Mm.
exploring.
I don't know if I'm there yet. I think I'm
Mm,
still at the thinking phase.
mm,
Um, but I'm really inspired by I've got amazing colleagues here who've been really enacting kind of slow scholarship,
okay.
which has been really inspirational. So
Mm-hmm,
kind of resisting
mm-hmm,
the kind of pull compulsion to kind of move rapidly through academia.
mm-hmm,
Um, and also to put much more time into the kind of quality of engagements and relationships and processes as a kind of fairly take, but again, it's quite a determined
mm,
practice.
mm,
I think within the aesthetics of performance, both the
mm,
process of making and the performance itself,
mm,
thinking about how that can have more flexibility and
mm.
possibility to be restful in a
Yeah,
way, or to have that within it. I don't know.
yeah,
I don't think I have the answers to that.
yeah.
But recognizing that there's definitely a politics to rest, and I think there's some really great Black feminist writing about that. Who
Mm,
gets to rest? Um, to rest is to make yourself very vulnerable
mm,
as well.
mm.
Um, and so, well, who has the opportunity to do that is really important. But yeah, there's some really, I'm still really thinking about the writing, but there's some really interesting writing about rest in pedagogy, and I'm really interested in thinking about that in teaching.
Yeah, yeah. To
Um,
build it into the teaching, right? Not after the teaching, so to speak, like
yeah,
as a dichotomy between rest and work, but that
yeah,
rest is part of the work.
yeah.
Yeah,
And that
yeah,
it's not necessary, it's not an either or, we don't, it's not a
yeah,
binary. Again, it's
yeah,
sort of
yeah,
these things can kind of fold into each other.
yeah.
Mm. So yeah,
Um,
I'm just at the beginning of thinking about it.
yeah, you talked about as part of your research coming across um a time when kids in school were meant to lie down and rest.
Yeah, so this was in the 1940s. There were new ideas about physical education circulating, coming to New Zealand, and in this experimental education scheme, in the documentation of it, as part of the PE lessons, the children were invited to lie down on the grass, and there's these images of them under the dappled light of the trees, just sort of lying down. And it is quite a radical image when education is seen as this kind of production of human capital, or then the production of citizens,
Mm,
or a nation building,
mm,
to sort of stop and
mm,
rest, and what that
mm,
might mean for the kind
mm,
of subject of education that it's trying to produce. And then in the work that we made at the race course, there's a moment in that where the audience are invited to lie down on the grass and
mm,
to listen to the sounds of the kuaka, the godwits who roost at the racecourse when they're
mm,
preparing for their migration back to Alaska. And
mm,
they hear some people talking about the godwits and sort of, yeah, and they're invited to lie on the grass and connect kind of through the body with the soil and the ground as a way of tuning in to the place through their bodies. Um, and so we've been thinking about rest aesthetically as something that does something in the rhythm of a work, any kind of performance practice or art practice, but also what it means, again, when we think about justice or we think about well-being, what does it mean to, I mean, was it really resting? We were like telling people, not, we weren't telling people to lie down. We were like inviting people to lie down in the context of a PE lesson. The children, you know, it's 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 a
yeah,
designated time for lying
yeah,
down. It's not
yeah,
their free choice
yeah,
necessarily. So
yeah,
there's all sorts of questions.
yeah. And the politics of rest, the art of rest, I guess, then
Yeah.
becomes a way to think about the aesthetics, but also then the sensuousness, the pleasure, the craft that goes into making a space, making the
Yeah.
invitation even, considering how to host rest, right? We sort of know how to host activity most of the time, but
Mm,
how do we host spaces and times and opportunities for rest? Probably, I
mm,
mean, thinking about it now, will demand our own enactment of breath and being to make some shifts towards a kind of more quiet presence,
yeah.
which is getting harder and harder, I think, to enact in an activity zone when you're in front of people rather than
Yeah.
when you're with people. But I like that you're bringing it back to justice and well-being, because we don't think of the injustice of a lack of rest, I think. We think of it as just an outcome.
Mm,
And uh, as you were speaking, I was wondering how the arts becomes a space to reach for deep rest, right? If you think of people coming into a space and being with other people in a reflexive mode that you were talking about. And I happened to be at a performance last night that really sought to do it. It was a very quiet, intimate space, not a regular theater space. And people sat in a circle on chairs and stools and on the mat and on the floor and all kinds of things. And there was one performer telling a story. There was a very spiritual story, but
mm,
nonetheless, the tone and the aesthetic that was brought by the team was really to invite people to sit with each other and sit with the character and be, you know,
mm,
and just allow that to happen. Um, and it makes me aware now, talking to you, that that is the artistry of this particular maker, I think, in wanting to explore something at the moment, because he was responding when he wrote this text to a particular moment in his life when he was dealing with mortality.
mm,
And so that does something, I think, to engender a particular question, because that's what the text is doing, and that's what the performance was doing. It was asking us to
mm,
sit with this question. Um, as a final space to kind of round off this conversation before we have the group conversation, what is it you think you need to work on for yourself to make space, to make these ways of being and doing and thinking continue to sustain and inspire you while you continue to give and contribute to the
mm,
landscapes, the multiple landscapes that you are part of?
mm. I think I I do find it continually sort of I get continually sort of invigorated and fulfilled by working and collaborating with other people. I just, you know, collaborations can go wrong, but so much of my thinking moves on because of conversations and relationships and collaborations with other people. And it can be really sustaining. I think, especially when you find people who have an understanding of the demands of whatever context it is you're working in, that you can work in ways that really sustain each other rather than push each other beyond limits. And I think
Mm,
finding those sorts of collaborative relationships are really important. And I don't want to go, I sort of, I think it is being quite forgiving
mm.
of yourself, but I don't know. I don't have the answers. I'm not very good at, I went through a Church of England education and I'm probably really instilled with the ethic of you don't rest until you've done all the work.
Good old wasp. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
So I
that
need to do
that
some unlearning.
yeah, yeah, that Protestant way of doing, which is familiar in this part of the world too, right? You know,
Yeah.
in Southeast Asia, East Asia, particularly the East Asian ethic of you keep going until you've done enough, and it's never enough. But
Mm.
I think the awareness to work through something that is evolving, especially with more young people saying enough is enough,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think is very heartening.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Molly.
Cool. Thanks so much, Charlene.
Once again, thank you very much, Molly, for reminding us that we need to respect and take responsibility for rest and well-being in relation to these issues of justice, and attend to questions of how to listen across borderlines of difference, where normative assumptions can often silence the pluralities of meaning. And that idea of navigating epistemic partners and co-constructing knowledge that becomes attentive to multiple frames and expectations is both inspiring and challenging. This for me is like a dramaturgy of dialogic encounters that is very appealing. Thank you everyone for listening. You're invited to also listen to the dialogues with Kelly Freebody and Selina Busby, and a joint dialogue where we come together to explore ideas as a group. These are all available on the NIE Care website.